right, well, let's get started here with our next portion of our time tonight. There's handouts in the back. I think there's also handouts there from last week, left over. So if you need something from last week, there's a few there. And if you're joining us virtually, I've been told there's also a place there you can download these handouts. So have that available to you as well. Well, hope you guys been having a good week and moving things along. We are continuing our study. We're actually towards the end. I think we got maybe a couple more, and then Thanksgiving in there where we do something a little different. So we're coming to, it's almost over. I have been, it's been noted, I was going to say accused, but that might be too intense. It's been noted that I kind of linger on things that are somewhat depressive. I don't know what that says about my personality. Some of my favorite days are the days that are dreary, kind of damp, and with a little nippiness of cold. So if you just put all that together, like when nobody else is outside on campus, people are just running from one building to the other. I'm just kind of, walking in that mess. I don't know. Ecclesiastes does happen to be one of my favorite books, so maybe there is something to it. I'll bring that up my next therapy session. But next quarter, we're going to talk about, at least I'm going to have a class. We're calling it Living God's Love, Faith Formation. We're going to talk about spiritual disciplines. So every class will be a spiritual discipline. So we'll talk about prayer one week, and then there'll be a handout with some ways to put prayer in practice. Then the next class, we'll talk about meditating on the Bible, on God's Word, and what does that look like in the biblical narrative. And then there'll be some practical applications, and we'll talk about a whole quarter of spiritual discipline. So that should be more peppy, right? I think that'll be more encouraging. So maybe you can look forward to that. So today we're in Jeremiah chapter 50 and 51. We're looking at the downfall of Babylon. Last class we saw how God used Babylon as his instrument to bring justice and punishment upon a world, not just Israel. Remember, we looked at a handful of other nations around. And it's not just judgment as God being petty and cruel because people didn't want to play, the way he wanted things done. It's the inevitable end result of a world of injustice. And so in a world where people power play each other, where there's corruption and violence, and my people are better than your people, inevitably that's the end result, is power playing and injustice and violence, and my people are better than your people in terms of like aggression. And so God allowed all that to unfold, and the instrument of that was Babylon upon that world. Well, but Babylon doesn't get a pass because Babylon is actually a great part of the problem. And so what goes around is coming around. And so Babylon today, we'll talk about the fall of Babylon. But guess where we're going to start? Anybody want to take a wild guess? Where are we going? Genesis, yes, thank you. Kelly, very insightful of you. Genesis, we're going to go Genesis chapter 11. And before you roll you've already rolled your eyes, but before you think why Genesis, we're going to the Tower of Babel. And there's a connection here. There's an intentional connection that I think too often is missed, but we're going to solve that today. So, Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11 is the end of the first of Genesis 1 through 11 is a package storyline. And it's really setting the stage for what unfolds beyond. So you got Genesis 1 and 2, creation story. It's introducing really God and what kind of world God, Yahweh, would create in a conversation, a contrast, compare and contrast with other creation stories of the time. Then Genesis 3 kind of really explains the mess we get into when we, instead of submitting to God and instead of accurately reflecting God, like being image bearers, and instead of that, we follow something else. We make ourselves like God instead of reflecting God. The world is just chaos returns. There's the serpent, evil, so forth. Genesis 4 through 11, there's these very important stories that are narrating and showcasing what does it look like in a world where Yahweh is not the only image we are bearing. What does it look like in a world where humanity is not but one family, but it is a divided people group, where we are doing things out of selfishness and my people, your people, power playing each other, where there's distrust, where lies are a common thing, where trust has been broken, where intimacy has been tainted, where shame is something that kind of leads the way we treat each other. So the stories, Cain and Abel, and then we got the whole the flood, the Tower of Babel, really is kind of, it sets the stage for what does the rest of the story look like. And so let's highlight a couple things and then we'll make a connection. So, in Genesis chapter 11, verse 1 and 2, now the whole world had one language and one common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Okay, put a pin drop right there. The plain of Shinar, to us untrained readers, right, and we're like thousands of years removed, this is the geography where Babylon becomes Babylon. The story of Babel is an ancient satire on Babylon. Right? It's an ancient satire on Babylon, especially as Babylon eventually became a very powerful nation. The satire part of it was then really emphasized and highlighted. But let me walk you there. So Shinar is really, you just read Babylon. So this is where Babylon is gathering humanity. When you see there one language and one common speech, the way stories in the Bible function is there's layers of meaning. I'd say interpretation, but that word is tainted. So there's layers of understanding, right? There's layers of meaning. So the very superficial meaning is literally just a language, right? Maybe they're all speaking Portuguese, right? They're all speaking Portuguese, and so that's one layer. But what the writer is really, in a very nuanced, intentional way doing is what they're gathering for is one worldview, one common purpose, okay? One common, not just a speech, but a narrative, one common narrative. And what is that narrative, right? And once again, where's the geography of this? This is Babylon. So Babylon is gathering humanity under one narrative, a set of talking points, one purpose, and what is that? Also important to note that even though two different words are used, later in the story of Daniel chapter 3, where you have King Nebuchadnezzar, right? So then we move the story way, way fast forward, and you're back to the time of Jeremiah and that whole mess. King Nebuchadnezzar puts a huge gold statue at this same geography as a monument to himself and the gods of Babylon. Okay? This is important because this is going to add clarity to what is the problem with the Tower of Babel. So hold that thought. Verse 3. They said to each other, here's this common narrative. Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. Now, once again, superficial level, unity. Is unity a good thing? We all for unity? Sure, it's a good thing. But what are they unifying around? Particular talking point, particular narrative, particular truth. Okay? And that is gathering momentum because they're using a new technology. We don't spread, a particular narrative today doesn't gather steam because of technology, does it? Sarcasm. Yes, it does. Somebody in their basement, in between snacks and, yelling something to their mom, decides to put something on the internet. And because of a technology, it just starts to gain steam, and then somebody picks it up, and then somebody picks it up, and then somebody picks, and then all of a sudden it is an accepted narrative. Once again, completely hypothetical. Right, you with me on this? This is what's happening. They have a particular technology. In this case, it's not as exciting as social media. They're just literally using bricks. And why that's important is because it's unique and it is allowing them to showcase a narrative that's gathering people around it. And the narrative itself is, we are going to be great. You're like, well, why is that exciting? Yes, what is that we are going to be great is really about? So they're building a tower. Now, is God anti-tall buildings? I don't know. I mean, if you've been to some of those buildings and you start to get a little, maybe God is not about height. And well, no, that's not the problem. In English, it gets a little complicated because we're like, there's this really tall tower. And somehow God's unhappy with this. Instead of tower, think of a religious building. It's a religious building. Like we might call it a church today. That implies a religious structure, right? So even, can you pick out a church building from, say, a grocery store just by the structure itself? Aren't there some certain details that's like, ooh, that's a religious place? Right? Nobody accidentally walks in a church building thinking, oh, wait, is this not the mall, or the supermarket or the zoo? There's characteristics to a religious building that make it religious. That's what's happening here. They're building a religious tower. And one would think, and it's a cool tower, much cooler than all the other religious buildings of the time because they were built with less impressive stuff. Somebody's got, a little tent over there with some stick that's supposed to represent their God. Ooh, but if you just go a little further down to this particular plane, what's going on there? They got some massive structure that seems to reach the heavens, and it's just shiny and better and bigger and cool. Wow, what God could they be worshiping there? We've never seen that building before. And even today, certain buildings, architecture say certain religious groups, doesn't it? Right? There's certain buildings you're like, oh, that's these folks, that's these folks. Yet their building is unique. One may even say set apart. Holy. Wow, I wonder what cool God they are worshiping. Let's go check it out. And then when you get there, the propaganda, or what God is being worshipped. Anybody? Themselves. Where did we hear that narrative before? If you're guessing Genesis, you're really close. Chapter 3, with the serpent says to Eve and then Adam, what God really is afraid is that what God really doesn't want is because then you will be like God. In other words, you're going to replace God. You will be God. So here is the building, here's the underlying foundational premise of what eventually becomes a massive, destructive, horrible empire of Babylon. And what is it built upon? The illusion that we can be God. That's what they're building. And folks like shiny, and folks like new, and folks like a narrative that just kind of makes sense. And so people are gathering. People are gathering. Verse 5. Oh, yeah, wait, one more thing. Where it says there, come, let us build for ourselves a city. This is also meant to be like, you scratch your head and be like, up to now in the story, so Genesis 1 through 11, where else did we see something about building a city? Anybody? Any Bible trivia? Yes, Cain. Cain goes out from the presence of the Lord and builds Cain City, the city of Cain. And what is he building? A worldview. It's a city built upon a very distorted worldview that does not include or completely include the presence of God. And what does Cain City eventually promote? A person like Lamech. Remember Lamech? First of all, he's like, I like women, so I'm going to have two. And then he's getting some kind of scuffle. And then he just kills a guy and he's singing a song about it. And then if you track his lineage, Cain, Lamech, you get to Nimrod, which does not inspire fear in the hearts of the modern reader, but it should. What do we think about when we hear the word Nimrod? Here's another trivia. This is bonus. Huh? Okay, somebody not very bright. And why do you think that is? The name literally means slayer of men. Why do we associate Nimrod with not a smart person? Anybody ever watch Bugs Bunny? Who's Nimrod on the Bugs Bunny show? Elmer Fudd, who is a hunter. Come on, that's on purpose. But because of Bugs Bunny, you and I laugh at Nimrod, where people in the ancient world would have been just in fear. Because Nimrod goes out and he builds two cities, which eventually is what became Assyria and what becomes Babylon. You with me? And then Genesis 11 is a satire of what becomes Babylon. And so it's all very cool and intense. Like even Bugs Bunny. You guys learn a lot of cool things. So here's this city, and it's a city that's going to be quite destructive and painful as history unfolds. Verse 5. But the Lord, so Yahweh comes down. What does that imply? Where's Yahweh's been? In the heavens. Now, don't think sky or where birds chirp and, atmosphere. In the ancient world, it was a pecking order. We are here. Then there's a world below us, and then there's some darkness and evil and Hades and death and, that kind of thing. But then there's a world above us, and who lives above us? The gods. So when you think the heavens here, a tower, a religious building trying to reach out to the heavens, which is the world of the gods, and who's trying to be put up there with the gods? People, humanity. So God, from his world, right, the world of the gods, he comes down to see what humans that are supposed to be image bearers of him, what kind of humanity, what kind of city are they actually creating? Is it the Garden of Eden kind of city? No, it's something destructive, something that's going to become brutal. So the Lord comes down and says, if one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. What I think this means is, if they can gather folks under this deceptive narrative, you can lie to people and you can convince them to do whatever horrible things you ever want. Has that historically not been sadly true? Have we lied to some folks and got humanity to do some horrible, horrible things to each other? So we got to put an end to this. So he comes and scatters all that over the face of the earth. So here's God promoting division. Because yes, unity is good, but if you're uniting under a distorted, evil, selfish, self-centered narrative, then no, what you really need then is division. So he comes and scatters them. And once again, in the ancient world, especially by the time Jeremiah comes around and this story has been told and retold, it's really making a satire of Babylon. And then as Babylon falls, that's where we're going in today, it really sits even as a now teaching moment of a satire, because Babylon, the narrative has fallen, right? That worldview has collapsed upon itself. So, verse 8, then the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth, and they stopped building the cities. So at least that narrative, to some degree or another, takes a stall. That is why they called it Babel, which in English also plays off of it. Babel, Babylon, babbling, that's kind of in Hebrew what's happening there too. Because the Lord confused their language over the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them all over the face of the whole earth. So, why is that important? Because that really sets the stage for why Babylon needs to fall. And why Babylon then will be destroyed and scattered, and just that worldview will, at least temporarily, decimate itself. And once again, if we connect it with Daniel chapter 3, Babylon is still doing what the Tower of Babel was trying to do. A monument to self. In that particular case, King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Right, so we good? Does that make sense? Do we see why we went to Genesis? So Nimrod, one should fear Nimrod. All right, judgment against Babylon. So Jeremiah chapter 50. This is what the Lord says. The people of Israel are oppressed, and the people of Judah as well. All their captors hold them fast, refusing to let them go. Yet their Redeemer is strong. The Lord Almighty is His name. He will vigorously defend their cause, so that He may bring rest to their land, but unrest to those who live in Babylon. And you're like, yeah, that's mighty words. Yet who's ruling the world? Babylon. Who's destroying every nation? Babylon. Whose gods must be really powerful and cool? Babylon. What narrative is really the truth? Babylon's. Or is it? God says, I'm Yahweh. I am the Redeemer. Once again, I want you to, and this theme keeps reoccurring. If you go back, when God, through Moses, goes to Pharaoh to demand that Pharaoh lets the slaves go, I want you to see the comedy. It's meant to be comedic. It's meant to be absurd. Because you have a disgraced leader who had to run away, Moses, right? Ran away, and for 40 years been caring for sheep, comes back old, looking like a homeless shepherd, and kind of smells like the country. And he comes to the great Pharaoh who sat on a throne of shininess and awesome, who represented the powerful gods of the most powerful nation on earth, and is making demands. if you were to bet, and not that we don't condone betting, but if you were to bet, where would you put your money? I know the Christian right answer at the Bible Bowl is like, with Moses, but we really wouldn't have. We would have put it with Israel or with Egypt. Well, here's what's happening again. Here's like big talk from some prophet that his own people don't care about, Jeremiah, who's his own people had to try to kill him, and now Babylon's destroying the world, is conquering the world, and here's some prophet for some unknown God who nobody really cares, claiming that Yahweh's coming. You think Babylon's worried? Anybody freaked out? Well, but they should, right? Because God's redeemer, God as a redeemer, is the real deal. Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 14. Take your positions around Babylon. Now he's metaphorically speaking to the eventually will be the Medo-Persians. All you who draw the bow, shoot at her, spare no arrow, for she has sinned against the Lord. Shout against her on every side. She surrenders, her towns will fall, her towers will fall, her walls are torn down. Since this is the vengeance of the Lord, take vengeance on her. Do to her as she has done to others. Remember that comes around, goes around. The world that you create is the world you're going to live in. Really is what's being said. Cain, the city you're going to go unfold, is the city that will promote a Lamech, that will promote a Babylon, that will promote an Assyria, that will crumble upon itself. That's historically accurate. It just repeats. Nations, grow and stuff, but they're corrupt and violent and unjust and whatever. It eventually backfires. Divine punishment, verse 17. Israel is a scattered flock that lions have chased away. The first to devour them was the king of Assyria, right? We're talking about the north here. Then the last to crush their bones was King Nebuchadnezzar. Now we're about 130 years after. Therefore, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. I will punish the king of Babylon in his land as I punished the king of Assyria. So God's taken ownership of that. But I will bring Israel back to her own pasture. Now, what's going to happen eventually? And we talked about this last time. But in those days, like when Israel returns, right? When it returns, search will be made for Israel's guilt, but there will be none. And for the sins of Judah, but none will be found. For I will forgive the remnant I spare. So there's a remnant that will survive the mess, that will still be faithful to God, and forgiveness will be what they experience, where everybody else is going to experience the mess they created. Verse 17, everyone is senseless and without knowledge. Every goldsmith is shamed by his idols. The images he makes are a fraud. They have no breath in them. They are worthless, the objects of mockery. When their judgment comes, they will perish. He who is the portion of Jacob is not like these, for he is the maker of all things, including the people of his inheritance. The Lord Almighty is his name. All these images that goldsmiths and whatever, are creating of Molech and whatever, and Zeus and something, that's really to the shame of the people that follow such fake things, or fake news, or fake narrative. It's a shame, it's an indictment on the people that are willing to follow that. But here's the thing. God, Yahweh, is different. Here's one reason why it's different. Does Yahweh have a particular idol that represents Yahweh? Us. We're the image bearers of God. Actually, the word idol and image are the same, just translated different in different contexts. So we are the image of God. We're not following some stone or stick, right? So those that will follow these idols, it's an indictment on them. And it's an indictment on their society. And it's an indictment on what's going to happen to them as that eventually will be proven false. Chapter 51, verse 52 and 53. But the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will punish her idols, talking about Babylon, and throughout her land the wounded will groan. Even if Babylon ascends to the heavens, come on, and fortifies her lofty stronghold, I will send a destroyer against her, declares the Lord. Where has Babylon tried to ascend to the heavens? Wink, wink. Have you ever heard of the satire of the Tower of Babel? That Yahweh is this Yahweh, and the result's going to be the same. That worldview is going to crumble. All right, before you get too excited about the fall of the enemies, let us venture into Ezekiel chapter 36, because this all really connects. Remember Ezekiel, Daniel, Jeremiah, Babylon, it all overlaps to different degrees. Chapter 36, verse 16. Again the word of the Lord came to me and said, Son of man, when the people of Israel were living in their own land, they defiled it by their conduct and their actions. Their conduct was like a woman's monthly uncleanness in my sight, so I poured out my wrath on them because they had shed blood in the land and because they had defiled it with their idols. Well, wait a minute. Are we talking about Babylon? Yeah, no, we're talking about God's people. But God's people has idols? Sadly, they did. Right? They became more like the other nations. And they shed blood. That's not just generically speaking because they were violent, but remember they killed their own children to idols of the Amorites and Canaanites. Verse 19, I dispersed them among the nations. Now the satire of Babylon or Babel is really also happening to God's people. God has scattered his people because they became like Babylon, like the people building the tower. So God is also scattering his people, not just the beginnings of Babylon and not just Babylon, but God's people acting like Babylon. So the satire is also upon them, or the story of the Tower of Babel. So I dispersed them among the nations, and they were scattered through the countries. I judged them according to their conduct and their actions. And whenever they went among the nations, they profaned my holy name, for it was said of them, these are the Lord's people, or these are Yahweh's people, yet they had to leave their land. I had concern for my holy name, which the people of Israel profaned among the nations where they had gone. So here's what God's saying. I've scattered them because they became like Babylon. They were unjust, violent, corrupt. Now, the whole nationalistic narrative of like, we're God's people and God's blessing us and cursing everybody else, not that that ever happens today, but you know, that language and that narrative is actually sadly quite common. Every group of people ever. But here's why this is different, because in this story, if God's people don't act like God's people, they also get the punishment the pagans get. So this isn't just some nationalistic propaganda. We're God's people and everybody else is going to burn in hell. You're God's people if you act like God's people, or you too will be scattered. All right? So you too will be scattered. And here's the problem. Israel was set apart in a world of gods and people groups that represented those gods. Israel was set apart to showcase Yahweh. Yet what are they doing? They're acting like everybody else. They're following other gods. So in doing so, they have profaned the name of God that they we're bearing. You with me? I made this point a couple classes before. The whole thou shalt not take the name in vain is not about cussing, even though one should not, but it's about if you claim to be a follower of God, or today Jesus, yet you act like people that do not follow God and Jesus, what are you really doing if not profaning that name? Does that make sense? Across the board, what is one word often, sadly, too often associated with Christians? Hypocrites. Number 2, judgmental. I'm thinking we've been profaning the name of God, because God is not hypocritical or judgmental as the word is used in today's world. So we're not doing a good job, and I may weave very broadly, right? That was a problem then. Verse 22, still Ezekiel 36. Therefore, because that's been an issue, therefore, say to the Israelites, now here's God, Ezekiel, the Israelites. This is what the sovereign Lord says. It is not for your sake, people of Israel, that I'm going to do these things. What are these things? Eventually bring you back. But for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you have gone. I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among the nations. This is an indictment on God's people. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the sovereign Lord, when I proved holy through you before them. Now, if we move forward, say to the time of Jesus, and we go to Matthew, say around chapter 5, verse 13 to 16, when it says, you are the light of the world, right? By your deeds, people will give glory to God. That's still the same call. And here's what God's saying, because here's how the ancient world thought, okay? Every people group had their god or gods, and they were often kind of geographical, and they believed the people next to them also had their gods, but most about everybody believed my gods are better than your gods. How do we know that to be true? We're blessed. You're not. It rains on our land. It doesn't rain on your land. If we ever go to war over resources, whoever wins has better gods. And here's where you really know if your God's all that, is if you maintain your geographical land. If you can maintain that, because you keep winning wars and whatever else, your God is powerful. So what's up with this Yahweh? He must not be much, because what's happening to his people? They're just being wiped down like everybody else, or wiped out like everybody else. But Yahweh says here, for my name's sake, I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to bring you back. And then people are going to be like, wow, they actually survived Babylon. Babylon didn't actually fail, and they came back. They're going to rebuild. And there's going to be a temple again to their God, to Yahweh. So I'm going to do these things so all the peoples around you will know actually Yahweh is Lord Almighty. Here's the sad thing, though. So we go through Nehemiah, and we're rebuilding the temple and the walls and the prophets and so forth. And then we eventually get to Jesus. But then once again, sadly, God's people are profaning his name and are acting like Babylon. And so the nation will fall and folks will be rescattered. Right? Or at least the geographical, the political nation. But God will gather folks again. There will be a remnant in Jesus, right? But we'll get there. Verse 24. For I will take you out of the nations, right? So God's going to bring them back. And Jeremiah says this too. After 70 years, God's going to bring you back, or a remnant, and God's going to allow you to rebuild and return. So Ezekiel's saying similar things. For I will take you then out of the nations, and I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back into your own land. I will sprinkle. Yeah, but what about the problem, right? The land is still defiled, and it's messy and contaminated and blood spilled and all this stuff. Like, what needs to happen there? Actually, he's going to use words here from Leviticus. Y'all remember Leviticus? Remember, there were certain things that defiled God's people. One was death. One was skin disease, right? Rashes and stuff. The other one was blood, or bodily fluids, which included blood. And so, like, when all that was happening, there was like this washing, watery, through the waters experience to wash that out so that people could be clean again. And so here's what's going to happen again. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. Is this starting to sound like the New Testament? Acts? Was there some washing going on there? Were their hearts pricked? Did God put a new spirit upon them? Did God gather all kinds of folks that spoke different languages unto that moment? You see where we're going? And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. Did Jesus talk about that? How God, it's not that in Jesus we have better legislation. We had 613 points to the law through Moses. Now in Jesus we have better ones. No, what we have in Jesus now is God's presence in our hearts. Not just at a temple, in us. It's not a geographical gathering around a temple, Jerusalem. It's gathering folks around Jesus. From all walks of life, from all parts of the world, from all socioeconomic groups. And what happens when we gather in Jesus? We are washed of our impurities, wink, wink, baptism. God gives us a new heart, and God gives us a new spirit, a spirit that will allow us to be transformed in how we live out what it means to have God's presence. You follow me? Verse 28, then, when all this is happening, right here is looking to the future, we're looking to the past, then you will live in the land I gave your ancestors. You will be my people, and I will be your God. So here we're also thinking eternity, and there they were talking about also some geography. But the idea is that what happens to Babylon, what happened to the nations, what happened to God's people, it's really because as a humanity, we have, since Genesis 3 forward, consistently, repeatedly defiled the name of God. And how we act, and the narratives we follow, and the people we gather around, and the political parties, and the flag, the nations, the whatevers, the whatever. We gather and profane the name of God. We have reoccurring Tower of Babel-like experiences. And humanity keeps doing it. But it all falls apart, but then we don't learn because then we redo it again under some other Tower of Babel experience. And folks, we're still doing it today. We're more sophisticated with it. But we're still doing it today. We still use similar language, similar narratives, similar distorted worldviews, similar propaganda. We just change some of the names and move forward. And we keep reliving Babylon, God's people falling apart. But here's the thing that's crystal clear from beginning to end. There's only one God, Yahweh, and He will not have His name profaned. which is also good news, because in Jesus, he's regathering, right? We scattered Babylon, because of Babylon, that whole narrative, it's always a scattering effect. It crumbles, things get scattered. But in Jesus, it's a regathering. Come on, folks. What does the word church literally mean? The gathered ones. You with me? What are we gathering around? Jesus. A new heart, a new spirit, washed through the waters as God had promised. And we, because of that, are to embody, to bear the name of God unto the nations. That's still the call is the same. Yes, from Genesis 1 forward. Does this make sense? Thoughts? Questions? Apprehensions? Yeah? Mm-hmm.
But this was something that God had planned for them to do all along, and the following verses indicates the dispersion did so they wouldn't disperse.
Yeah.
There's other things besides just the fact of the tower.
Mm-hmm. God has always wanted humanity to be gathered, but around Him. But every time we replace Him with whatever Towers of Babel equivalent, God will disperse it. It'll fall apart. But He continues to regather, but now it's God with us, right? Jesus. So, yeah, the imagery has continued the same. It's just the story progresses along and finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus. That's why the whole storyline is one story culminating in Jesus. Yes?
I think instead of saying, make America great again, you ought to say, make America godly.
Yeah. Yes, what should move us as a people group is God's presence. Not a flag, not politics, not a party. We're to be God's people. And guess what will really make that possible? Those that gather around Jesus and accurately bear that image unto the nations, America included. Right? Let's be God's people. And that's really the solution. All right, so just a little practical reflection for you to be sent on your way. As we consider Ezekiel chapter 36, in what ways today are we possibly still defiling the name of God? If you want to be introspective and think about that. Next time, we're actually going to get into Lamentations. We've introduced it at the very, very first class, but we're going to walk ourselves through a little bit of that. So join us. I think, like I said, I think we got a couple more classes and we should be wrapping this up. Let's close with a prayer. God, we thank you for the opportunity to gather around Jesus. We thank you for washing us. We thank you for a new heart. And we thank you for your Spirit. Help us to bear your image accurately and to, instead of profaning your name, that we may reflect your glory unto the nations around us. It is in your Son's name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.